This is a download for The Philosopher's Arms, pints and philosophical puzzles presented by Mathew Sweet.
Hello! Hello, and welcome to The Philosopher's Arms, Radio 4's largely conceptual drinking establishment, and the only pub in England where the dry-roasted nuts are stapled to a photograph of Roger Scruton in hunting gear. Each week we gather a saloon full of professional thinkers. We bring them together with barroom philosophers, with other experts, and with, well, some drunks, frankly. And together we think through a classic philosophical puzzle suggested by something that happened to me on the way to the pub. Now, this week I want to tell you about my daughter. She's 6 years old and her name's Maria, and she's great. She's adopted, but her older sister quickly adjusted to having her around. She's one of those kids who's really full of life, always charging about the place. She never sits still unless she's reading. I took her out this morning to the park, partly because I wanted to explain to her that we couldn't quite afford to go on holiday this year. While we were there, she fell off a swing and she hurt her leg. Or at least I thought that she'd hurt her leg. Actually, a little patch of skin had folded open to reveal something very unexpected, an on-off switch. It was quite a surprise to discover that she was a robot. But then I thought, if we powered her down for a couple of weeks, perhaps the rest of us could go on holiday without her. "Don't switch me off, Daddy," she said, "and can I have an ice cream?" So my question to you is this. Now I know that Maria is a machine, should I treat her any differently to her sister? How do we solve a problem like Maria? Any thoughts? Stick your hand up, tap your glass, and this microphone can be yours, yes.
I think it depends on how you view your other daughter, because if you was to kind of view human beings as simply mechanisms, then maybe you should treat her as you treat your other daughter.
So I should be examining the rest of my children as well as her. This is a debate about the rest of them too.
It'd be quite handy to be able to turn them off for a while. I mean, if you could do that with real kids, it'd be good too. But
Yeah, well, I think that may be material for a different debate. But is there anybody... but who thinks I should go on holiday?
I do think you should go on holiday. Turn the robot off.
Why do you think that, sir?
Because it's a robot, not a person.
Anybody have
Sorry,
a qualm about that?
This is self-evident to me, at least.
Yes, sir.
But if she is behaving like a human, then maybe you should treat her as one.
OK, well, I think we've uncovered some excellent thoughts already. But here in the snug with me is Professor Barry Smith, who's Director of the Institute of Philosophy. Barry, what kind of dilemma do I have here?
I think this raises questions about the nature of consciousness. So although we have answers to lots of different things about the way the world works and the way nature is structured and about the stars and the universe, the one remaining mystery, it seems, is what is consciousness? You know, to smell freshly cut grass, what it's like to taste lemon, what it's like to scratch an itch when it really starts to irritate you. It's very hard to say how this inner awareness and experience can be accommodated in a world of molecules and particles, the comings and goings, the whirrings and grindings of all the neural and chemical stuff that make me up.
What's the pedigree of this idea?
Consciousness studies really started with René Descartes, I guess, because Descartes thought there was a big distinction between the body and the mind. They were made of different kinds of stuff. So he was called a dualist. There were just two kinds of stuff that made up the world, mental stuff and physical stuff. And the mind was amaterial, spiritual, and the body was physical. But interestingly, he knew there had to be a connection between the two. What's the point of having a mind if it can't affect your behavior and steer you around the world? So the interaction between this mental and immaterial soul and the physical body was the big problem. So nowadays we're more interested in the idea that creatures with bodies and brains somehow give rise to consciousness. But how do we do that? And could other things made of silicon do that too?
Thank you. Who thinks she may be conscious?
Sarah. So all you've seen is that she has an on-off switch and you're assuming that she has a robot and that therefore she isn't conscious. But she may be a robot with consciousness, and so she may well be someone with feelings and emotions who's aware her parents have gone away on holiday without her and suffers because of that.
So even if she is still a robot,
she may be a robot with feelings.
She may be deeply dismayed to be left in a cupboard while I'm in Fuengirola. Yes. Sir.
Which then begs the question, are you also an automaton? Are you also a robot? In which case, until you can answer that, you probably ought to treat her the same as you treat anybody else.
OK, so the jury may still be out. Yes, sir.
if
taking her on holiday is going to give you pleasure, and it's going to give her pleasure, and she's going to share that pleasure, then what does it matter?
Barry, we're throwing around these science fiction concepts, but are there older philosophical debates underpinning this argument?
Well, I think the answers that people have been giving are bringing out a couple of things. One is the worry about whether we are just robots. But the other issue is whether if a robot behaved like us, talked, smiled, laughed, blushed, responded to us in the same way that other people do, we would be prepared to think it was conscious. Now, this set of issues has been around for a very long time. It started in Descartes' time, wondering about whether if you made a mechanical creature that acted like us, it would also be conscious, and he thought no, because it didn't speak. You have people like La Mettrie in the 17th century thinking, and 18th century thinking that you've got to have a purely mechanical view of us because we're part of nature, so we're just machines like other machines, we're just more sophisticated. Now, the question we've been asking was brought up by William James in a delightful context in the 19th century, where James said, if you had the ability to create a mechanical sweetheart who laughed and talked and blushed and, as he quaintly put it, performed all the feminine offices, would you feel the same about it? Now, he thinks the answer to that is no. And I think the reason why this question recurs and recurs is because as soon as we start to think we've got mechanistic explanations of some of the things we're doing in terms of our biology or in terms of our brain and neural mechanisms, we begin to worry about whether we're just robots. But now philosophers like John Searle say, you can build as many replications of us as you want. You can build them out of tin cans or out of silicon. They'll never have understanding. They'll never have conscious awareness. It's not about just replicating the physical stuff we're made of. You want to know when replicating it actually produces consciousness. And until we know what produces consciousness, we can't answer that question.
Well, I think that it might be a good time to bring you in, Murray Shanahan. You're the creator of intelligent machines, I think is probably the best way to put it. You build machines that respond to environments in complex ways. What will be the first generation intelligent machines that we might suspect contain some kind of consciousness?
Something which people would call an upload, such as a mouse upload. So if you were to take the brain of a mouse and scan it in extraordinary detail, you make this perfect map of all the neurons, their types and the way they're wired together, and you then build a computer program that simulates the activity of all of those neurons. Moreover, you connect it to a robot, and the robot has a mouse-like body, and the resulting thing behaves like a mouse and squeals like a mouse and moves around like a mouse, then we might want to think twice about not ascribing it consciousness.
And in that case, you would have qualms, would you, about switching off that mouse in the way that you might have qualms about stamping on an organic one?
I certainly think it's a question that we should take seriously, and it's not obvious to me that we should feel okay about just switching it off.
Barry, it's science fiction at the moment. It sounds pretty plausible, doesn't it?
Well, it kind of worries me in a way, because if we were to treat this as a mouse having consciousness that a normal mouse has, we're still no further on in finding out what makes consciousness possible. And I thought that was what the point of building robots and artificial devices was.
But do you agree that this thing might be legitimate to call it conscious under these circumstances?
I think it might show quite the opposite. I mean, we tend to think if we built something that talked and walked and laughed and cried and behaved like one of us, we would think it's conscious, but it might just show you could do all of that without being conscious. Look, one of the things that's happened recently from the 19th century onwards, and certainly very much going on in the 21st century, is the unseating of consciousness from the central place in the mind. We now know that a lot of what we can do can be done by unconscious processes and neural mechanisms, and that we think we're doing more of our guiding and deciding than we actually are. Now, I think that unsettling and unseating of consciousness might lead us all the way to thinking, in us, we're lucky consciousness is just a lovely added extra. Perhaps it doesn't do very much at all apart from give us the quality of awareness of our own experience.
So, Barry, what would have to happen for you to be convinced of the possibility of consciousness residing in a machine? I mean, if my daughter could start describing what it felt like to be Maria, to fall off this swing, to have sensation, to have experience, I mean, wouldn't you be at all persuaded?
No, not really. I mean, I think I wouldn't... given that consciousness is something that each of us knows only for sure from the inside. I know I'm conscious. I don't know whether Matthew is or any of you are, but I know I am. And each of you, I hope, have got a similar feeling of being directly aware of your lived inner life. Then we've got this problem of deciding what the boundaries are. When do we decide that a creature that looks and walks and behaves and talks like us really is conscious? It might be one thing to treat something as though it were conscious. It behaves as if it were conscious. But we might want to wonder, is that the same thing as it actually being conscious?
Surely if we see her to be conscious, and in every way that we look at her that she's conscious, then she's identical, really, to the other daughter. And if we start treating her differently, then that has an impact on the way we might treat other people, because we don't know straight away that they're conscious. And I think that that has implications for our own actions and sort of the morality behind those. So it seems to me difficult that you would.
I think there are two things. Yeah, I think there are two things though in what you say, and we should separate them. One is, suppose she wasn't conscious but behaved in all the same ways that we do. Should we treat her morally differently? Good question. Don't know. So it's not just the question of is she conscious, but even if she's not, how should we behave towards her? There are lots of animals that are not conscious, according to me, and I don't stand on them.
You're up at the Philosopher's Arms with me, Mathew Sweet. Another pint, please, Gladys, and some of those nuts. Tonight we're asking, does my robot daughter have the same moral status as her flesh and blood sister? OK, I think there's one important idea that has emerged here so far, and that's what's the difference between a being that has consciousness and a being that behaves consistently as if it had consciousness? That's an idea to which many philosophers, researchers have applied themselves, isn't it, Barry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between what we call in the trade and philosophy epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology is how do we know if something's conscious? That's applying to ourselves or machines or animals or infants. And there's another question of what it is to be conscious. So these are different things, and we can't get quick gains just by answering the question about how do we know. We still have to find out, what is consciousness? How does it arise? What does it come from? What does it consist in? What makes it possible for the world of nature to contain some parts of that nature which think about it and reflect and experience it? We don't know the answer to that.
OK, well, I feel right now that I'm just in a slightly more sophisticated state of ignorance than I was at the beginning of this conversation.
Now you're doing philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I feel it's getting me nowhere, really, because, Barry, you say that machines can't be conscious. Murray says that they can. Both of you seem to agree that there might possibly be, at some point in the future, machines that could exist that were indistinguishable from conscious human beings. I still don't know whether it would be morally wrong to put Maria on standby while I took my biological family to Lesbos. Maybe we should try and get a bit more of a handle on what we think consciousness actually is. I want to raise the question of the Turing test and get to the bottom of what that might be and how that might help us answer this question. Murray, what is it?
OK, so Alan Turing was a very important mathematician, did a great deal of work during the war, of course, that helped us win the war, so it's often said, through his work with code breaking. He wrote some very significant papers about the foundations of computing and also about the foundations of artificial intelligence. And he proposed a scenario where somebody was sitting in a room and they have two teletypes, because in those days you had teletypes. And with these teletypes, you're interacting with, on the one hand, a machine,